This leads directly to recognizing, as Sato pointed out last night in her talk, the significance of what the Buddha proclaimed at his awakening. I, together with all sentient beings and the great earth, simultaneously attain awakening. That's such an extraordinary statement. I, together with all beings. And if you're like me, perhaps for years you've been pondering what that is pointing to. And if we look at the words, there are things to be noticed here. One is, he says, together with all beings, I, together with all beings, meaning nothing, no one is separate. There's no separate, no me, no you. I, together with all sentient beings and the great earth, simultaneously attain awakening. And he says attain rather than attained. It's the present tense rather than the past tense, which is a detail that I have never noticed before this session. The present tense, ongoing, I attain, not in the past, but altogether now. Now after now after now, I attain. And then he says simultaneously, I, together with all sentient beings in the great earth, simultaneously attain awakening. This is a primary statement about Sangha, about the fact, the function, the form, and the way it all unfolds, and when it unfolds. Simultaneously, we awaken to the entirety of the way, the relative and the absolute, all come together, all come forward, and all of us do this together each moment. Buddha realized awakening when he looked up and saw the morning star. And he was content at last. He was content to enjoy the fulfillment of his purpose. He didn't think anyone would understand what he had realized. But according to the mythic telling of this, Brahma, the creator god, comes to him and urges him and says, please teach. There are those with only a small bit of dust in their eye. Please teach. Return to the Saha world, the world of desire, and help all beings realize their true life just as you have, says Brahma. So after a little while, according to the sutra, he actually stays put for a little while, a few weeks. Before his enlightenment, Siddhartha was fueled in his search by desire. Even though it was a wholesome desire, it was a desire to find an end to the suffering that comes with sickness, old age, and death. In this case, he was spurred by wholesome meaning in the direction of liberation from the causes of suffering. But after his realization, he was motivated and guided by his original vow. He did not desire, he was free of desire. He was guided and motivated by vow to find a way to cure the suffering that comes from ignorance. He didn't know the cure when he started out. He didn't know the cure, just as we don't know the cure for our own suffering until we discover the medicine and practice taking it, as we're doing in sesshin and as we do in our daily practice. He shifted from a life guided primarily by desire and preference to living according to vow. And this is what he passed to his disciples to awaken themselves and then help to awaken others. So the Buddha did get back on the road and he began to teach. And the Sangha was born. We're all on this raft together, the infinite raft of moment to moment presence. In this very breath, we're benefiting from the one life that we share with Siddhartha Gautama Shakyamuni Buddha. The one human life we all share. So I'd like tonight to turn our sights to the story that's not so usually looked at these days, the story of the Sangha, that is to be found in great detail in the Pali Canon, much of which we have in our library at the Zen Center. The life of the Sangha unfolded person by person, disciple by disciple, town by town, incident by incident. And because of the Buddha's awakening, the Sangha began. The sutras in the Pali Canon describe extensively not only the teachings, but how they came about and how they intertwined with the everyday life of the Sangha and the people of the town and the cities, how it developed and grew and took on a life of its own. The infinite raft of moment-to-moment presence in human society. This is the story of the Pali Canon. You've heard and chanted many of the names of the Buddha's disciples of that day, the early Sangha leaders, Ananda, Shariputra, Moggallana, Mahakashyapa, Subhuti, Anuruddha, Upali, Rahula, his son, Mahapajapati, and Gautami, to name just a very few. Along the way, and as you go through these sutras, practically every sutra you meet new people. You meet them by name. And along the way, there are many, many teaching moments where the Buddha clarified the Dharma. He had his awakening insight, his awakening moment. But after awakening begins the lifelong process of clarifying the awakening, clarifying our view. And he clarified, the Buddha clarified the Dharma, and his disciples did. And his disciples also, both of them, both the disciples and the Buddha, walked all over and spread out far and wide to share the Dharma and to teach. And as they did this, the numbers following the teachings and the teacher grew. And so did the challenges. The group challenges. Anytime something went wrong or conflict arose, the Sangha learned more about how to apply the basic insights of impermanence, interdependence, and no self to ordinary daily situations. And we too have that same opportunity in our own Sangha, in our own lives, how to bring the teachings to life. And this is actually one of the first definitions that I heard of for the word discipline, which is bringing life to learning. So we bring our lives to the Buddha's teachings. Or what good are they? What's this all about if we don't? There were those who immediately recognized the Buddha as their wise guide, but there were also those who came to hear him teach, or one of his disciples teach, who came just out of curiosity, or because just then it was becoming the thing to do, the in thing, which is rather similar now, actually. the Buddha's fame was growing. And so along with fame came trouble. Right here in River City came misunderstanding and reactivity as a consequence of the Buddha's enlightenment. So it's kind of interesting, huh? Along with enlightenment comes everything else. No separation. So one of the troubles came when the Buddha welcomed untouchables into the Sangha. It immediately touched off strong opposition by the higher castes. And we see that same kind of reactivity to any kind of change throughout the history of our own country. And most recently, the strong reactivity to immigrants being granted entry and citizenship in the US. If we've not reckoned with the inevitability of change to our comforts, our habits, or whatever it is that we claim for ourselves, we can get pretty upset with change. His teachings challenged the prevailing caste system. He actually intended such. His teachings were also misunderstood by those who were embedded in their own limited views about spiritual life. So here's an example. One afternoon, the Buddha received a young man whose face was lined with grief and misery. The Buddha learned that the man had recently lost his only son, and for several days he stood in the cemetery crying out loud, my son, where have you gone?" Desperate with grief and confusion. The Buddha told him, "In love, there is suffering." Well, the man immediately objected, "You're wrong. Love doesn't cause suffering. Love brings only happiness and joy." And the bereaved man abruptly left before the Buddha could explain what he had meant. This happens in Zen centers too. Just something that is said without deep understanding of its significance and how it relates more broadly offends, and then somebody leaves. So he says, "You are wrong," and he abruptly leaves before the Buddha could explain what he meant. And the man wandered aimlessly about until he stopped to chat with a group of men gambling in the street. He told them what the Buddha said, and the men agreed with him that the Buddha was mistaken. "You're right," one of them said. "That monk Gautama is wrong." And this story spread the same way things like this do, fast and freely, and was taken at face value, meaning in the ordinary way, it was unexamined. It was just passed along and probably inflated as it went. The Buddha's teaching, and what he would have gone on to say, is that there's a kind of love that leads to happiness and removes suffering. The difference is that any love that is based on attachment and discrimination and me and mine, and subject to changing conditions and the truth of the impermanence of everything, will lead to loss and sorrow. But there's another kind of love recommended by the Buddha, taught by the Buddha, which is unconditioned and demands nothing in return. Maitri, or metta. Metta has the capacity to bring happiness to ourselves and others. It brings happiness. And then there's also karuna, compassion, another form of love, which has the capacity to remove another's suffering. This is what he would have said had he had the opportunity. So along with Sangha comes the responsibility to hold a wide view and keep in mind the consequences of careless talk and of our own limited understanding about whatever we hear through the grapevine, hearsay, gossip, opinion, and the reactivity that comes with opinion, which is most everything these days in the media and on the street. How we live in the Sangha has effects in the wider community. Our precepts are sure guides to help us sort through the competing demands of a very complex society. The precepts that emerged from this period when the Buddha was teaching, they guide not just our own actions, but even more, not just our actions, but even more our attitudes and the condition of our heart that we bring out and about with us into every quarter of our life. So conflict came along, continues to come along, not just in the community at large, but even in the Sangha, the Buddha Sangha, there were the usual issues that come from claiming and protecting territory. In the Pali Nikayas, there are many examples of vehemently held views that were brought to the Buddha. And then how corrosive this can be for the Sangha when they're not brought through into our practice. When we are not practicing strenuously with what is the nature of preference and opinions and how it functions, not in the way to bring judgment, but to bring understanding and insight. So an example of a problem in the Sangha is offered at the monastery of Gosira. Certain bhikkhus were assigned the task of memorizing the Buddha's teachings. They were called sutra masters. And then there were the precept masters, who were expert in the different precepts for novices and ordained and householder people. A conflict arose between a sutra master and a precept master that stemmed from a very small event, but mushroomed into creating a sharp division in the Sangha. The incident was, are you ready? The sutra master forgot to clean out the wash basin and was taken to task by the precept master for violating a precept. This is the stuff of our lives, no matter where we are or who we live with. One thing led to another, and many of the students of each of the masters took the side of their teacher. This became really intense. They brought the argument to the Buddha, who met with the precept master and then with the sutra master to see if he could help them reconcile their difference, their attitudes, to no avail. The conflict spread then to the larger community. It kept going, and to other religious sects. It was a serious blow to the integrity of the Sangha. People took a second look at the Buddha's teachings, not in a friendly way. So after attempts to bring reconciliation continued to fail, the Buddha left. The Buddha left. When I came across that, I couldn't believe my eyes. He left. So I pondered this detail, that he left when the arguments seemed to be taking over. There was a moment that came when he was no longer of use there. And after briefly visiting Anuruddha in his harmonious Sangha in the eastern bamboo forest, where his zest for life was renewed by the harmonious and friendly and wise way that this Sangha lived together. He stayed for the rest of the rainy season alone in the Rakita forest, apart from any human Sangha, enjoying the Sangha of the sal trees. And this brought to mind, when I got to this part, what Sato had shared about Kyogen's comment when he said, and you who were here last night might remember that, I can only teach those who are on the raft. We have to be willing to reconcile. And the Buddha saw that that was not where people were going. That was not the direction, and there didn't seem to be any way to intercede. We have to be willing to reconcile, or there is no settling of conflict. Just the same old resort to power and violence. The Buddha saw everyone quite dug in. Those who were on the raft, and there were many bhikkhus who had seen into the nature of suffering and discontent, and did try to haul those back who were swept along in the river of anger and pride onto the raft. But it took time. It took time. There are certain energies that need to be played out, it seems. We have been swept into them ourselves recently. In the meantime, the Buddha, off in his retreat, continued to clarify a code of conduct and practice for ordained people called the Vinaya or the Vinaya. He saw that in a large community where there are all kinds of people, some bhikkhus needed rules and guidelines in order to better discipline themselves. We need structure to learn. We need a certain amount of structure to learn particulars. He came up with a way that could be used in all this kind of circumstance for those who adhere to it. And also a warning that certain behaviors that violate the spirit of the Sangha and make practice impossible for the Sangha could lead in extreme conditions to exclusion. So the Buddha knew that there were some limits that needed to be set to secure the Sangha, to secure the teachings, to make it possible for people to awaken. He was very practical and detailed in his instructions to us. Sometimes it's a bit, it tries one's patience to read the sutras in the Pali Canon because there's so much minute repetition of the lists of instruction. But he set out here from this experience a process for reconciliation. It's an example of the way that Dharma clarity gets offered into the world. Why do you think that, what is the connection between just sitting, and saving all beings? Well, first we clear our hearts and our habits. We get really clear about them. We really open them. And then sometimes we can see more clearly what is best to do. Often we can see better what is best to do. And the timing, what is a good time to do it? And sometimes doing nothing, as the Buddha did, is all that we can do for the time being. So Shariputra asked him, how do we handle this conflict? The Buddha answered, handle it according to the Dharma. This was before he realized that it was nothing was going to help. But his answer pointed immediately to examining our own minds. We always begin in our practice with examining our own experience. being aware of it, not taking for granted what is going on. And so when he said this to Shariputra said, well, can you explain what you mean more clearly than handle it according to the Dharma, which is a pretty general statement. And the Buddha says, if a bhikkhu takes to quarreling and brawling and is deep in disputes, stabbing others with verbal daggers, then his mind is obsessed. When the bhikkhu is practicing carefully and sees clearly the quality of his mind, he will be freed from obsession. And these are the words from the canon itself. He understands thus: there is no obsession unabandoned in myself that might so obsess my mind that I cannot know and see things as they actually are. My mind is well disposed for awakening to the truths. This is the first knowledge attained by him that is noble and not shared by ordinary people. So he's saying again, I'm aware when I'm obsessed, and I have a vow to awaken. This is the first knowledge attained by him that is noble, or her that is noble, or they that are noble, that is noble, but is not shared by ordinary people. And what he's pointing at there is, ordinarily, we don't necessarily keep track of when we're obsessed, we get caught. That is a very entangling, energetic, and when it gets started, it's sometimes very hard to even be aware of it. And then he goes on to give us instruction about this as character work, which is so all important and can't be avoided when engaging in Sangha. Actually, all relationships that a person of practice has. He goes on, he says, a noble disciple considers thus: do I possess the character of a person who possesses right view? What is the character of a person who possesses right view? Although he may commit some kind of offense for which a means of rehabilitation has been laid down, still, nonetheless, he at once confesses, reveals, and discloses it to the teacher or wise companions. And having done that, he enters upon restraint for the future. Just as a young, tender infant lying prone at once draws back when he puts his hand or foot on a live coal, so too, that is the character of a person who possesses right view. So in other words, we can make mistakes and learn from them. This is the path. Further along, the Buddha, after he's returned to the Sangha, and the disputants are ready to reconcile, it was quite some months later. And sometimes it takes a long time after much harm is done to reconcile. Witness many divorces or suing for peace between nations. It can take a lot of harm and destruction before people say, enough, I'm ready. So Moggallana, Kasyapa, Kachana, Kotiya, and Anuruddha arrive and ask the same question. How do we help the factions reconcile? They are ready. And the Buddha says to them, well, listen to both sides without prejudice. Consider carefully everything you hear to see if they are in accord with the teachings and which things are not in accord with the teachings. So reconciliation is a process of learning, seeing what needs to be learned, first of all. Excuse me. When you know which things are in accord with the Dharma and which things are not, you will know what to do. And then he suggests, this is kind of cute, offer food to both sides. He's very practical. Sometimes it's pretty hard to resolve conflict when we're hungry or tired. And then the second thing you do is you express your support for the Sangha. And that's saying that the value that we have is, our biggest concern is the collective well-being. How the collective well-being can be restored. And then offer your praise when any of them says things in accord with the Dharma. Strengthen with praise what you want to amplify, what you want to strengthen. And then it's a basic principle of parenting. And then he outlines an aspect of discipline. He says how we give life to learning, how we learn from our mistakes, giving life to learning. And he outlines a ceremony of confession and reconciliation with 7 steps. The first step is face-to-face sitting, which means stating the dispute before all the parties involved and the community to come to a congruent description so that everybody agrees what happened. And then the next thing is remembering from the beginning everything that led up to the conflict clearly. Also very important, because early intervention is way potent, way better than not catching it early. It gets more and more difficult the further it goes. The third is establishing that both parties are willing to resolve the conflict and reach reconciliation. Absolutely important. If you have and this is worth taking a lot of time with, to look at what is the motivation here. Is there true willingness? And within ourselves too. And then the voluntary confession. So each person admits their own transgressions and takes responsibility for what they contribute to the conflict. And then everyone agrees to go along with whatever the will of the group is in relation to this conflict resolution. The last one is non-stubbornness, which is also called covering mud with straw, where the Sangha elders, who are well respected by all parties, and they represent each side in the conflict, and then they help the parties soothe and heal their wounds. So this sounds a lot like loving kindness. This is what the Buddha suggested whenever anyone has violated the spirit of the Sangha. And as Sado defined last night, discipline binds us to that which we love, from which we want to learn. So this is very much an example of that. And the Buddha is very practical. This is the intention of all the teachings, is to free us from the suffering, the dissatisfaction that comes with not recognizing the nature of all of our mind states. So in the time of the Buddha or now, once we're on the raft, we are always in Sangha. Continuous practice is the way. Whether it's the Buddha Sangha or the Sangha of all beings, the same teachings help us, guide us, remind us, and liberate us. So let's use them well and use them always. Thank you.